The trap was set, the evidence airtight. Emily and Alexander had spent the past 2 days meticulously compiling everything they needed to expose William Hartman. Every document, email, and transaction was catalogued, forming an undeniable case against the VP of Development. But the tension in the air was razor-sharp. If anything went wrong, the fallout could be catastrophic, for Prescott Group, for Alexander's reputation, and for Emily, whose involvement had become more personal than professional. The day began with an executive board meeting, a rare full-attendance event that promised fireworks. Emily stood outside the conference room, clutching her tablet, her palms damp. Through the glass walls, she could see the board members filing in, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Hartman entered last, his confident stride and smug smile making her stomach churn. He greeted a few colleagues, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. "Ready." Alexander's deep voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him standing beside her, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to amplify his commanding presence. His piercing blue eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the world faded. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good," he said, his hand brushing her arm, a fleeting touch that sent warmth coursing through her. "Let's end this." The meeting began with routine updates, but Alexander wasted no time steering the conversation. "Before we proceed to the quarterly report," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I need to address a matter of critical importance." All eyes turned to him, the room falling silent. "In recent weeks, we've discovered evidence of internal sabotage," Alexander continued, his gaze sweeping over the table. "Sensitive company information has been leaked to a competitor, jeopardizing not only our current projects but the integrity of this organization." A murmur spread through the boardroom, nervous glances exchanged like wildfire. Alexander raised a hand, silencing them. "The evidence we've gathered points to a single source, William Hartman." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Hartman's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flash of panic before he composed himself. "That's a serious accusation, Alexander," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Do you have any proof to back it up?" Alexander didn't blink. "Plenty." He gestured to Emily, who stepped forward with her tablet. With a few taps, the large screen at the front of the room lit up, displaying a series of damning emails, financial transactions, and security logs. "This," Alexander said, pointing to the screen, "is evidence of unauthorized access to confidential files. These transactions," he continued, motioning to another slide, "link Hartman directly to Haverton Corporation. And these," his voice dropped, "are encrypted messages sent from Hartman's account to an external party." The room fell silent as the weight of the evidence settled over them. Hartman's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "You're framing me." Alexander's expression was ice-cold. "We don't need to frame you, Hartman. You did this to yourself." Hartman pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. "You'll regret this, Prescott." "Not as much as you will," Alexander replied, nodding to security personnel waiting just outside. The guard stepped in, and Hartman's bluster vanished. He was escorted out, his protests fading as the doors closed behind him. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Board members bombarded Alexander with questions, expressing outrage and concern over the breach. But Alexander, ever the strategist, had answers ready. Emily stood at the back of the room, her chest tight with adrenaline. It was over. They'd won. But the victory felt bittersweet. The way Hartman had reacted left her unsettled, as if the danger wasn't entirely behind them. That evening, Emily returned to her desk to find a note waiting for her. "Well played. But it's not over." Her stomach dropped. She glanced around, her heart racing, but the office was mostly empty. Alexander appeared moments later, his tie loosened and his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, leading her back to his office. The door closed behind them, and Alexander turned to face her. "I don't trust coincidences," he said, holding up a nearly identical note to the one Emily had just received. Her blood ran cold. "You got one too?" He nodded. "Whoever's behind this isn't working alone." Hartman was just the first domino. Emily sank into the chair across from his desk, her mind spinning. "What do we do now?" Alexander leaned forward, his gaze fierce. "We dig deeper. Whoever sent these notes is still out there, and they're not finished." "But what if they're watching us?" she asked, her voice trembling. They are, he said simply. And that's exactly why we need to stay one step ahead. The weight of his words settled over her, but beneath the fear was a flicker of determination. We'll find them, Emily said, meeting his gaze. Alexander smiled, a dark, dangerous smile. Yes, we will. And when we do, they'll regret ever stepping into my world. Emily sat in her apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window as she sifted through yet another set of Prescott Group files on her laptop. The adrenaline from the day's events had yet to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the danger they were facing. The note had been a stark reminder: Hartman was only part of a larger scheme. Someone else was out there, and they were playing a game far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Alexander, can you come back to the office? Found something you need to see. Emily stared at the message for a moment, her heart racing. It was nearly midnight, but she didn't hesitate. Emily, on my way. The Prescott Group headquarters was eerily quiet at night. The hum of fluorescent lights and the soft buzz of the elevators were the only sounds as Emily made her way to Alexander's office. When she arrived, the door was slightly ajar. She knocked softly before stepping inside. Alexander was seated at his desk, his tie gone and his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked up as she entered, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Thanks for coming, he said, gesturing for her to sit. What did you find? She asked, her curiosity outweighing her exhaustion. He slid a stack of documents across the desk. These were buried in an archived server. They're contracts, but the dates don't match up with our records. Someone's been altering them, making deals under the table. Emily's brows knitted as she flipped through the pages. These payments, they're siphoning money out of the company. Alexander nodded, his expression grim. It's embezzlement. And it started long before Hartman was even in the picture. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Who could have that kind of access? Someone high up, Alexander said, leaning back in his chair. But until we have more proof, we can't make a move. Their eyes met, the weight of the situation settling between them. I need you to keep looking, Alexander said. I trust you, Emily. You've been a step ahead of everyone else in this mess. Her breath caught at the rare compliment. Thank you, she said softly. And, for the record, he added, his voice dropping, I don't give my trust easily. They worked side by side for hours, the office bathed in the soft glow of desk lamps and the city lights beyond the windows. The tension between them was palpable, heightened by the late hour and the quiet intimacy of the space. At one point, Emily leaned over to show Alexander something on her screen, and their hands brushed. The spark was immediate, sending a jolt through her. She glanced up, meeting his gaze, and found herself unable to look away. Emily, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. Yes. You're too good at this, he said, a hint of a smirk breaking the tension. It's almost unsettling. She laughed, the sound breaking the tension. I'll take that as a compliment. You should, he said, his eyes lingering on hers. Because I don't say it lightly. The air between them thickened again, the unspoken pull growing stronger. We should get back to work, she said, breaking the moment. Right, Alexander said, though his gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned back to his laptop. By the time they called it a night, it was nearly 3 a.m. Emily gathered her things, her mind still racing with everything they'd uncovered. As she reached the door, Alexander's voice stopped her. Emily. She turned to find him standing, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Be careful, he said. Whoever we're dealing with, they're dangerous. I will, she promised, her chest tightening at the concern in his tone. He nodded, his eyes softening. Good night, Emily. Good night, Alexander, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. As she left the office, her heart was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, determination, and something far more complicated. The next morning, Emily woke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. One caught her attention immediately, a message from an unknown number. You're in over your head. Walk away while you still can. Her blood ran cold. Emily stared at her phone, the cryptic message glaring back at her like a threat carved in stone. Her stomach churned, her instinct screaming that she was in real danger. She considered calling the number back, but something stopped her, logic, maybe, or fear of what she might hear on the other end. Instead, she forwarded the message to Alexander, adding a brief note. I just received this. What should we do? His reply was immediate. Come to the office. Now. By the time Emily arrived at Prescott Group headquarters, Alexander was already waiting for her in his office. He was pacing, his jaw tight, his usual air of control slipping just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath the surface. Show me, he said the moment she stepped inside. Emily handed him her phone, her heart pounding as she watched him read the message. His expression darkened with every passing second. This is escalating, he said, his voice low and dangerous. He set the phone on his desk and looked at her, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. We can't ignore this anymore. They're targeting you directly now. She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. What do you mean we? This is your company, your fight. You're not just anything, Alexander interrupted, his tone sharp. He stepped closer, his intensity pinning her in place. You're in this because of me. Because I trusted you with something dangerous. And now, whoever's behind this sees you as a threat. His words sent a chill down her spine. So what do? We fight back, he said, his voice like steel. Over the next several hours, Alexander launched into action, his ruthlessness on full display. He called in a private cybersecurity firm, ordered a sweep of the company's systems, and assigned discreet security personnel to watch Emily's apartment and shadow her movements. Isn't this overkill? Emily asked, her voice tinged with disbelief as Alexander relayed his plans. He turned to her, his gaze unyielding. Not when your safety is on the line. The declaration hit her like a punch to the chest. She tried to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced her. Emily, he said softly, his voice dropping. This isn't a negotiation. If anything happened to you because of this, I'd never forgive myself. Her breath hitched at the raw emotion in his tone. For a moment, she saw a side of Alexander he rarely showed, a man who cared deeply, even if he tried to hide it behind his icy exterior. Okay, she said finally. But I'm not going to stop helping. I can't. His lips twitched into a faint smile. I wouldn't expect anything less. As the day wore on, the tension between them reached a boiling point. Alexander's protectiveness, combined with Emily's determination to stay involved, created a friction that neither of them could ignore. Late that afternoon, as they reviewed more of the doctored contracts, Emily couldn't hold back any longer. You're used to controlling everything, she said, her voice sharp. But you can't control this, not entirely. Alexander's jaw tightened. And what do you suggest? That I sit back and let them come after you. I'm saying we need to trust each other, she replied, her tone fierce. This isn't just about power plays and corporate sabotage anymore. It's personal, for both of us. For a moment, the room was silent, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. You're right, Alexander said finally, his voice soft but resolute. This is personal. And that's why I'm not going to let you out of my sight until this is over. Her heart skipped a beat at the intensity in his gaze. Alexander. Before she could finish, his phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He answered quickly, his expression shifting to one of controlled fury as he listened. Understood, he said curtly, ending the call. What is it? Emily asked, her stomach twisting. That was security, Alexander said, his voice cold. They caught someone trying to access my private files. It wasn't Hartman, it was someone else on the executive team. Who? Carla Davis, he said, his tone laced with disbelief. Head of legal. Emily's eyes widened. Carla was one of the most respected executives in the company, a poised, calculating woman who always seemed untouchable. She's been playing us this entire time, Alexander said, his fists clenching. And now she's mine. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Carla was called into Alexander's office under the pretense of discussing routine legal matters. Emily watched from her desk as Carla strode inside, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. From the way Alexander's door slammed shut behind her, Emily knew this was no routine meeting. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. When the door finally opened, Alexander emerged, his expression a mixture of triumph and anger. She confessed, he said, his voice low but fierce. Carla was working with Hartman, and someone else. But she wouldn't give up their name. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What happens now? She's gone, Alexander said. Security escorted her out. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. That evening, as Emily packed up her things, Alexander approached her desk. I'm driving you home, he said, leaving no room for argument. I can manage, she said, though she knew it was futile. Humor me, he replied, his lips curving into a faint smirk. In the car, the tension between them was palpable. The city lights blurred past as Alexander navigated the streets with practiced ease, his jaw tight with unspoken thoughts. When they arrived at her apartment, he walked her to the door, his hand hovering protectively at her back. Thank you, she said softly, turning to face him. His eyes softened, the intensity in them replaced by something warmer. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we take the fight to them. Before she could respond, he stepped closer, his gaze dropping to her lips. Emily, he said, his voice low and rough. Yes. Be careful, he said, his breath brushing against her skin. Because the more I care about you, the harder it gets to stay in control. Her heart thundered in her chest. Maybe it's time to stop trying. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, the tension between them unbearable. But instead, he stepped back, his expression torn. Good night, Emily, he said, his voice hoarse. As she watched him walk away, she couldn't help but feel that their fight against the enemy wasn't the only battle they were waging. The next morning, Emily arrived at Prescott Group with a weight pressing down on her chest. Carla's betrayal had shifted the entire landscape of their investigation. What once felt like a clear path to justice now seemed murky, with shadows creeping in from every direction. Alexander was already in his office when she arrived, standing by the window, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call the moment she walked in, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. Close the door, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily obeyed, setting her bag down as she approached his desk. Security did another sweep of Carla's office last night, Alexander began, his voice clipped. They found more encrypted files, contracts, emails, even personal memos. She was playing a long game, and she wasn't working alone. Emily nodded, her stomach tightening. Who else could be involved? Alexander's jaw tightened. That's what we need to find out. But whoever it is, they're getting desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. The day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander and Emily worked tirelessly, combing through Carla's files for any clues that might reveal her accomplice. Tensions were high, the pressure mounting with every passing hour. By late afternoon, Emily's patience was wearing thin. There's nothing here, she said, tossing another stack of papers onto the desk. Whoever's behind this is covering their tracks too well. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. There's always a trail, Emily. We just haven't found it yet. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. What if we're wrong? What if? We're not wrong, Alexander interrupted, his voice firm. We're close. I can feel it. For a moment, their eyes met, and Emily felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name, determination, maybe, or the faintest flicker of hope. We'll figure it out, she said softly. Alexander's lips twitched into a faint smile. We will. Because failure isn't an option. That evening, Emily stayed late once again, determined to make progress. The office was quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by the soft hum of the air conditioning. As she sat at her desk, her focus was interrupted by a soft ping from her email. Subject: Final warning. Sender: unknown. Message: You've had your chance. Walk away, or face the consequences. Emily's blood ran cold. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. This wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Without thinking, she forwarded the email to Alexander, adding a simple note. I just received this. What now? His reply came almost instantly. Stay where you are. I'm coming. Alexander arrived minutes later, his expression dark as he entered her office. Show me, he said. Emily turned her screen toward him, her heart pounding as he read the email. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. They're escalating, he said, his voice low and dangerous. They want you scared. Well, it's working, she admitted, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. Alexander's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his presence grounding her. They're trying to intimidate you, Emily. But they don't know who they're dealing with. For a moment, she couldn't look away from him. His confidence, his resolve, it was infectious. What do we do? She asked. We hit back, Alexander said, his voice like steel. But first, I need you to promise me something. What? That you'll trust me, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. No matter what happens. Her breath hitched. I trust you. The following day, Alexander called an emergency meeting with his private security team. Emily was included, a testament to how deeply involved she'd become in the fight to protect Prescott Group. We're dealing with professionals, Alexander said, addressing the team. They're smart, well-funded, and clearly willing to cross lines. But they've made one mistake. They underestimated us. He turned to Emily, his expression fierce. You're going to keep digging. I've assigned extra security to shadow you. If anything seems off, you report it immediately. She nodded, her resolve strengthening. By mid-afternoon, Emily had a breakthrough. Buried in Carla's encrypted files was a single name, one that made her stomach drop. Alexander, she said, rushing into his office. He looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing as she handed him the document. It's Grace, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's expression darkened. You're sure? Emily nodded. The file links her directly to a series of offshore accounts. She's been funneling money out of the company for years, alongside Carla. For a moment, Alexander didn't move. Then slowly, he stood, his gaze hardening. Call security, he said. We're ending this now. The tension in the office was suffocating as Emily watched Alexander summon his private security team. His movements were precise, every gesture radiating control, but Emily knew him well enough by now to see the storm brewing beneath the surface. When Grace was escorted into Alexander's office moments later, she walked in with her usual air of confidence, her tailored suit pristine and her head held high. She glanced at Emily briefly before focusing on Alexander, her expression unreadable. You called for me? She asked, her voice smooth. Alexander gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Sit. Grace arched a brow but complied, crossing her legs and leaning back with a faint smirk. What's this about? Alexander slid the document across the desk. Care to explain this? Grace's eyes flicked to the paper. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she composed herself. I don't know what this is, she said, her tone even. Alexander's jaw tightened, his voice dangerously calm. Don't lie to me, Grace. We've traced these accounts back to you. Offshore holdings, payments to Carla Davis, and connections to Haverton Corporation. It's all here. Grace's smirk faltered, and she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. You don't understand, Alexander. Then help me, he said, his voice sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been betraying this company, and me for years. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Emily watched, her heart pounding as Grace finally broke eye contact. Fine, Grace said, her voice low. You want the truth? Here it is, I didn't have a choice. Alexander's brows furrowed. What are you talking about? Grace sighed, leaning back in her chair. It started 3 years ago. I received an anonymous email. Someone had dirt on me, on my family. They threatened to expose everything unless I cooperated. And you just gave in? Alexander asked, his voice laced with disbelief. You don't know what they had on me, Grace snapped. If it came out, it would have destroyed my career, my life. So yes, I did what they asked. I funneled money, passed along information, covered for Carla. But I wasn't doing it because I wanted to. Emily's stomach churned. The confession was damning, but it also painted a picture of someone trapped in a web far more dangerous than she'd realized. Who's behind it? Alexander demanded. Grace hesitated, her eyes darting to the door. I don't know. They never gave me a name. They communicated through encrypted messages, sent instructions, and warned me not to ask questions. Alexander leaned forward, his expression dark. If you're lying to me. I'm not, Grace interrupted. But you have to understand, whoever they are, they're powerful. They've been planning this for a long time. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Grace's confession hanging heavy in the air. Do you have any of those messages? Emily asked finally, her voice quiet but firm. Grace nodded reluctantly. They're stored on a private server. I'll give you access, but you're not going to like what you find. Alexander stood, his movements sharp. Then it's time we find out exactly who we're dealing with. An hour later, Emily sat in Alexander's office, her fingers flying over her laptop as she combed through the encrypted messages Grace had provided. Alexander stood behind her, his presence a steadying force as they pieced together the puzzle. "There," Emily said, pointing to the screen. "This message mentions a meeting at the Sovereign Club. That's exclusive, it's where the city's elite go to handle business off the record." Alexander's jaw tightened. If they're using the Sovereign Club, it means they're confident no one will connect them. "But we just did." Emily glanced up at him. "What now?" "We go there," Alexander said, his voice resolute. Her eyes widened. "You can't just walk in and confront them." "I'm not planning to," he said, his lips curving into a dangerous smile. "But if they're meeting there, we'll find out who they are, and end this." The Sovereign Club was as opulent as Emily had imagined, all dark wood, sparkling chandeliers, and an air of exclusivity that made her feel instantly out of place. She walked beside Alexander, her nerves buzzing as they made their way to the lounge area. Alexander's confidence was unshakable, his presence commanding enough to make people step aside without a word. He scanned the room, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. "There," he said, nodding toward a secluded corner. Emily followed his gaze and saw two men seated at a small table, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. "That's Robert Lane," Alexander murmured. "CEO of Lane Tech and one of Haverton's biggest investors." Emily's heart raced. "Do you think he's the one behind this?" Alexander's expression hardened. "We're about to find out." As the night wore on, Alexander and Emily observed from a distance, piecing together the dynamics at play. It was clear that Lane wasn't working alone. Several others approached him throughout the evening, exchanging words and documents before disappearing into the crowd. By the time they left, Emily's mind was spinning with possibilities. "This is bigger than I thought," she said as they stepped into Alexander's car. "It always is," Alexander replied, his tone grim. "But now we have names. And with names come weaknesses." He turned to her, his gaze softening. "You've done more than I ever expected, Emily. But this fight is far from over." She met his eyes, her resolve strengthening. "I'm not giving up. Not now." Alexander smiled, a rare genuine smile that made her chest tighten. "Good," he said. "Because I'm going to need you for what comes next."